The vibration didn't start in the air. It started in the marrow of Hank's bones. On the scarred workbench, a ceramic mug of cold coffee began to dance, sending rhythmic, concentric ripples across the dark surface, as the heavy thrum of hydraulic steel outside grew into a bone-shaking roar. Through the grime-streaked window, a massive yellow blade bit into the earth, not just clearing land, but tearing through the property line like it was wet paper. As the first fence post snapped with the sound of a bone breaking, Hank reached into the shadows of his shop and pulled out a stolen laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a cold, clinical glow over his grease-stained hands, revealing a digital map of the town that looked nothing like the one on the news. Underneath the blueprints for the new factory lay a labyrinth of hidden tunnels and chemical symbols that shouldn't exist. A sudden, violent shadow eclipsed the workshop door as three men stepped in, their silhouettes heavy and menacing against the midday sun. One of them didn't say a word. He simply reached for a sledgehammer on the rack and swung it with a grunt of practiced aggression. Hank felt the cold weight of the laptop against his ribs. A device that held enough secrets to bury the town's elite or get him buried first. The machine outside roared again, a mechanical predator closing in, and Hank realized the ground beneath his feet was already gone. Henry Hank Mallory crouched over a galvanized steel basin, scooping a handful of frigid water to splash against his face. The shock of the cold bit into his skin, a necessary jolt to purge the lingering fog of a 3-hour sleep. Inside the workshop, the air held its usual heavy perfume, the sharp tang of burnt slag, the earthy musk of aged machine oil, and the metallic scent of iron. Hank ran a calloused, grease-stained palm across the scarred surface of his workbench, his fingers trekking over the familiar geography of laid-out wrenches, a soldering iron, and various disassembled gears. This sanctuary usually offered a silence so profound it felt solid. But today, that peace shattered. A low, vibrating thrum began to resonate through the floorboards, a rhythmic growl that set the thin glass panes in their wooden frames to dancing. On the edge of the bench, a ceramic mug containing the dregs of lukewarm coffee rippled, concentric circles forming a miniature storm on the dark surface. Hank felt the vibration travel through the soles of his work boots, crawling up his shins. The roar of Global Steel's heavy machinery intensified, swelling into a dense wall of sound that pressed against his eardrums and evicted the quietude he had cultivated for a lifetime. Outside, the violence of progress manifested in the form of a massive yellow bulldozer. The machine, bearing the polished Global Steel emblem, lunged forward with indifferent power. Its steel blade bit into the chain-link fence, marking the boundary of the neighboring property, crumpling the galvanized mesh like discarded foil. Metal shrieked against metal. Fence posts, once anchored deep in the Kentucky soil, ripped free with dry, snapping protests, churning up plumes of gritty gray dust that coated the dying grass. Sam Taylor, Hank's neighbor, stumbled out onto the dirt road, his face a mask of frantic desperation. He waved his weathered arms, shouting curses that the roar of the engines swallowed whole. The driver of the bulldozer didn't so much as tilt his head. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon of the new construction. Hank's fingers curled into tight knots at his sides. He watched a group of workers in neon-orange vests exchange smirks, leaning on their shovels as if watching a local comedy act. One builder, a thick-necked man with a permanent sneer, spat into the dirt at Sam's feet and took a predatory step toward the old farmer. Hank didn't hesitate. He cleared the distance between his porch and the road in 3 long, lunging strides, planting his solid frame between the advancing worker and the shaking, white-haired man. The confrontation stalled when a black, lacquered SUV skidded to a halt at the edge of the torn earth. The scent of high-octane gasoline and scorched rubber wafted from the vehicle, thick and suffocating. Mayor Richard Thornton stepped out, his movements calculated and smooth. He reached up to adjust a silk tie that appeared immune to the swirling dust of the construction site. Two security guards, their eyes hidden behind opaque lenses and their arms crossed over tactical vests, flanked him like statues of modern intimidation. Thornton didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he unfurled a glossy, oversized development map, the smell of fresh printer ink sharp in the humid afternoon air. The mayor's manicured finger landed with a dull thud on a vibrant red zone, the exact coordinates of Hank's workshop. Thornton spoke through a tight, practiced smile. His words clipped as he pointed toward the churning machinery and the forest of steel piles rising for the new logistics hub. Hank stared into Thornton's gray, predatory eyes. He felt the heat of a slow-burning rage climb his throat. A fire fueled by the sight of his heritage being reclassified as an obstacle on a bureaucrat's blueprint. Desperate for a legal foothold, Hank pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Hollow Creek Municipal Building. The interior air was stagnant, a suffocating mixture of industrial bleach and the sweet, musty odor of decaying paper. Behind a high, imposing counter sat a clerk in thick-rimmed glasses, her focus tethered to a flickering monitor. Hank spread his yellowed property deeds and ancestral blueprints across the Formica surface, the paper brittle under his touch. Without looking up, the woman slid a thick stack of standardized complaint forms toward him, her movements robotic. Hank tried to point to the discrepancies in the boundary markings, his voice steady but insistent. Yet the clerk merely extended a finger toward a small plastic sign detailing the strictly observed office hours. As he turned to leave, the echo of his boots against the linoleum sounded hollow and defeated. Behind him, the rhythmic metallic thud of the clerk's stamp continued, a steady heartbeat of bureaucracy that seemed to be marking the seconds until his world was leveled. Hank paused in the empty reception area, his hand on the brass door handle. His gaze snagged on a rich, leather briefcase left unattended on a chair near the mayor's inner sanctum. The flap hung slightly ajar, revealing the brushed silver corner of a slim laptop, the city's official seal engraved on its lid. From behind the closed office door, Thornton's muffled, arrogant laughter spilled out, a sound of unearned victory. Hank's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, matching the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He glanced at the hallway, then at the door. In one fluid, desperate motion, he stepped back, snagged the device, and shoved it beneath the heavy fabric of his flannel work jacket. The cold metal of the laptop felt like a brand against his ribs. He exited the building with long, purposeful strides, refusing to look back. The weight of the stolen secret felt like a physical anchor, pulling at his shoulder as he hurried down the sidewalk toward the safety of his workshop. Once inside the dim sanctuary of his shop, Hank connected the mayor's laptop to an isolated power block. The screen erupted in a harsh, clinical white light that threw long shadows against the walls of tools. Hank's fingers, thick but precise, danced across the keys as he cycled through common administrative bypasses. After a final, satisfying click, the desktop revealed a labyrinth of hidden directories labeled with the cryptic tag Priority 0. He opened a lead file, and a series of schematics unfurled that bore no resemblance to the public plans Thornton had brandished at the site. Dark blue lines representing vast underground tunnels carved through the digital map of Hollow Creek, diving far deeper than the footings for any warehouse. Hank felt a cold, oily sweat break out on his forehead. He watched the cursor hover over a long list of chemical compounds, substances that had nothing to do with global logistics and everything to do with toxic waste. Hank scrolled through endless spreadsheets of financial data. The rows were a blur of six-figure sums, each one neatly aligned with the Global Steel logo and Richard Thornton's initials. The dates were damning, coinciding perfectly with every major zoning approval and the forced eviction of local families. He opened scans of offshore bank accounts, seeing them swell with consultation fees every time a local landmark was slated for demolition. A notification popped up in the corner, an encrypted email from a global steel executive thanking the mayor for finalizing the territory issue. Hank gripped the edge of his workbench so hard, his knuckles turned the color of bone. Every digit on the screen felt like a drop of blood squeezed from the town. These weren't just numbers. They were the price tags for the souls of his neighbors, sold by a man who wore the city's trust like a cheap suit. The deeper Hank dug, the more the logistics hub revealed its true skeletal form. He opened a 3D structural model, revealing massive concrete caverns situated directly beneath the proposed warehouses. The blueprints were annotated with specifications for high-grade filtration systems and hermetic seals designed for hazardous containment. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The hub was a facade, a hollow shell meant to hide a massive chemical dump in the very heart of Hollow Creek. He traced the incline of the drainage pipes on the screen. They led directly toward the aquifer that supplied the town's drinking water. Hank touched the screen, his finger tracing the outlines of the reservoirs that would soon be pregnant with poison. He breathed heavily, the air in the workshop suddenly feeling thin. His shop, once just a place of labor, was now a tiny, fragile island of truth in a rising sea of corporate filth. Later that evening, Hank waited in the long shadows of a derelict parking lot. He was there to meet Officer Miller, a man he had known since they were boys catching crawfish in the creek. The patrol car pulled in, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Miller stepped out, adjusting his cap and casting a nervous, darting glance around the empty lot. Before Hank could step forward, a man in a sharp gray suit, one of Thornton's administrative hounds, approached the officer. Hank watched from the darkness as the aide handed Miller a thick envelope, bulging and secured with a heavy rubber band. Miller didn't hesitate. He tucked the bribe into the inner pocket of his uniform and offered a short, firm nod. The two men shook hands briefly before Miller climbed back into his cruiser and pulled away. Hank retreated further into the shadows, a cold void opening in his chest. The law in Hollow Creek wasn't just blind. It was on the payroll. The silence of the following morning was shattered when the workshop door flew open under the force of a heavy boot. 3 men in worn leather jackets stormed in, bringing the smell of stale cigarettes and aggression. One of Thornton's enforcers grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from the rack and swung it with practiced violence. The diagnostic monitor on Hank's bench exploded into a shower of crystalline shards and sparks. Hank stood motionless, his face a mask of controlled fury, as a second man kicked over a shelf of precision tools, sending brass fittings scattering across the floor. The leader of the group stepped into Hank's personal space, his breath a foul mix of tobacco and cheap coffee. He demanded the laptop in a low, vibrating growl. Hank remained silent, his eyes recording every detail of their faces, every scar and tattoo. When the men finally left, leaving a wake of shattered glass and ruined equipment, Hank slowly reached down. He picked up a heavy, steel wrench that had survived the carnage, his muscles trembling as he gripped the cold metal. Knowing time was a luxury he no longer possessed, Hank sat at his secondary terminal. He inserted a series of flash drives, watching the progress bars crawl across the screen. He meticulously partitioned the financial records, the chemical manifests, and the underground schematics onto 3 separate encrypted drives. He hid the first one deep within the hollow casting of an old lathe. The second, he carefully stitched into the heavy quilted lining of his work jacket. The third copy he sealed in a thick plastic bag and buried beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the shop. These small slivers of plastic were his only leverage, his only shield against the vast, dark resources of Global Steel. His life had officially become a target, and every footfall on the gravel outside now caused him to instinctively check the hidden weight of his secrets. As the sun began to dip below the Kentucky hills, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, Hank moved to the entrance of his shop. He threw the heavy steel deadbolt into place, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped space. He reached for the chains of the industrial security shutters, pulling them down until the slats clicked into the floor tracks, sealing the windows. He stood in the sudden, artificial twilight of the workshop, the smell of ozone and fear hanging in the air. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a man under siege, locked in a fortress of his own making, waiting for the storm he knew was coming. The following morning, the air in the workshop felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of cold metal and the lingering ozone from the previous night's electronics. The heavy steel door groaned as Richard Thornton pushed his way inside, his polished Oxfords clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor. He looked out of place among the grease and iron, a silk-clad vulture in a den of labor. In his hand, he carried a sleek, leather-bound briefcase. Without an invitation, Thornton cleared a space on the cluttered workbench, shoving aside a tray of brass fittings to make room for the case. The metallic snap of the latches echoed sharply. As the lid fell back, Hank was met with the sight of stacked $100 bills bound in clean, clinical paper strips. The smell of fresh ink and the mayor's expensive, cloying cologne filled the workspace. Thornton drummed his fingers on the edge of the case, his eyes flicking toward the shadows where the laptop had been. He offered a thin, predatory smile that didn't reach his cold, gray eyes, waiting for the greed to take hold. Hank didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his large, grease-stained hand slamming the lid of the briefcase shut, the sound like a clap of thunder. Thornton flinched, his manicured fingers narrowly escaping the crush. Hank snatched the handle of the case and pivoted toward the door. He threw the heavy deadbolt back and stepped out into the humid Kentucky air. With a powerful, fluid heave, he launched the briefcase into the air. It sailed over the fence line, landing with a wet thud in the churned, muddy earth of the construction site. A massive Global Steel excavator, its engine roaring, lurched forward. The heavy steel tracks groaned as they climbed over the leather case, flattening it into the muck. The wind caught the released currency, swirling green slips of paper into the gray sky like confetti for a funeral. Thornton's face drained of color, his mouth agape as he watched his leverage vanish into the mire. Hank wiped his hands on a piece of oily rag and stepped back into the shadows of his shop. His gaze locked on the mayor's trembling, rage-filled silhouette. The screech of tires announcing a patrol car's arrival broke the tense silence. Sheriff Miller climbed out of the vehicle, his movement sluggish and heavy. He adjusted the leather duty belt that strained against his waist, his hand resting habitually near his holster. He carried a single sheet of paper, the official gold seal of the state glinting in the harsh afternoon light. Miller marched to the workshop window and pressed the search warrant against the glass, the legal jargon visible even through the grime. The document formally accused Hank of the theft of municipal property. The swirling red and blue lights of the cruiser painted the interior of the shop in a frantic, strobe-like rhythm. Miller's face remained a mask of stony indifference as he demanded Hank vacate the premises immediately. Hank stared through the glass, seeing not a friend, but a man whose integrity had been methodically dismantled and replaced by corporate interest. Hank retreated to the back of the shop, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. He needed to call someone, anyone, beyond the city limits. He tapped the banking app, but the screen flickered and died, replaced by a cold, systemic error message. He tried his primary line, only to see a notification that his service had been suspended. A final alert flashed on the screen. An official notice from the Department of Licensing stating that his workshop's operating permit had been revoked due to emergency safety violations. The device was now a useless slab of glass and silicon, a tether cut. He tossed the phone onto a pile of scrap metal, the hollow clatter echoing his isolation. Outside, the low, discordant murmur of a gathering crowd began to drift through the walls. The sound of a community being turned into a weapon. He moved to the front shutters and peered through a narrow gap. A crowd of nearly 30 people had coalesced at the edge of his property, their faces twisted into masks of directed anger. At the front stood Jake Harris, a man Hank had worked alongside for a decade. Jake was hoisting a hand-painted sign, his voice rising above the rest as he branded Hank an elitist and a traitor to the town's future. Neighbors who had once borrowed tools and shared holiday meals were now shouting for Hank to stop stalling the wheels of progress. Hank watched them, seeing the desperation in their eyes, a desperation Thornton had expertly harvested. The collective roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wall of noise that felt more destructive than the bulldozers idling in the distance. Hank stepped out onto the small wooden porch, raising his hands in a plea for silence. He held up the printed schematics he had taken from the laptop, the diagrams of the chemical pits clear and damning. "Look at this," he shouted, his voice cracking against the wind. "They aren't building a hub, they're building a tomb." But a sudden, violent gust of wind caught the papers, scattering them into the dirt. Simultaneously, a global steel driver nearby revved his engine, the massive diesel roar drowning out Hank's words in a cloud of thick, black exhaust. The crowd jeered, their taunts rising in a sharp, mocking crescendo. A heavy soda can sailed through the air, clattering against the steel door behind Hank's head. He looked at the faces of his friends and saw only a wall of willful blindness. A town that would rather drink poison than face a tomorrow without a paycheck. The sound of shattering glass erupted from the rear of the workshop. 2 glass bottles, stuffed with gasoline-soaked rags, arched through the broken window and impacted against the wooden tool racks. Liquid fire bloomed instantly, orange tongues of flame licking hungrily at the stacks of old manuals and oily rags. Hank lunged for the heavy fire extinguisher mounted by the door, ripping the safety pin free with a frantic jerk. A cloud of white caustic powder erupted from the nozzle, smothering the primary flames in a hissing chemical fog. He coughed, the thick gray smoke stinging his lungs and blurring his vision. Through the jagged remains of the window, he caught a glimpse of 2 figures in dark hoodies vanishing into the maze of construction debris. The fire died down to a smolder, leaving the air thick with the smell of scorched wood and spent chemicals. Sheriff Miller didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He ordered 2 patrol cars to pull across the workshop's gravel drive, effectively sealing the exit. His deputies began unrolling bright yellow tape, the words "Quarantine Zone" stark against the industrial backdrop. Miller picked up a megaphone, his voice booming and distorted as he announced to the crowd that a hazardous chemical leak had been detected on the Mallory property. He declared the area off-limits to all civilians for their own protection. Hank watched from behind the scorched curtains as the perimeter was established. The workshop was no longer just a shop. It was a cage, cordoned off by men with badges and guns. He realized with a sinking heart that the quarantine was a masterpiece of legal theater designed to ensure that whatever happened next would have no witnesses. The ground beneath the shop groaned as a massive steel excavator tooth bit into the earth just feet from the front door. With a sickening, subterranean pop, a high-pressure water main burst. A geyser of brown, silt-heavy water erupted into the air, drenching the front of the building and turning the yard into a slurry of mud. Inside, the pipes hammered and shrieked before the faucets fell silent. Moments later, a crew of global steelworkers approached the power pole at the edge of the lot. With long-handled insulated cutters, they severed the lines. The overhead lights in the workshop flickered and died, plunging the interior into a gloomy, oppressive twilight. The sound of the workers' laughter drifted through the walls as they began backfilling the trench, physically and metaphorically burying Hank's connection to the world. Hank climbed the rickety wooden ladder to the cramped attic space, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He pressed his binoculars to a small vent in the gable. Half a mile away, on a freshly leveled plateau of red Kentucky clay, he saw Thornton. The mayor was raising a crystal flute of champagne, surrounded by men in expensive, tailored suits. They were standing in front of the first massive steel pile, which had been festive with ribbons as if it were a maypole rather than a herald of ruin. The late afternoon sun glinted off the bubbles in Thornton's glass, a stark contrast to the mud and smoke of the Mallory shop. Hank gripped the binoculars until his knuckles ached, watching the elite of the town celebrate the inaugural spike of their own destruction. He climbed back down and clicked on a small, battery-operated radio. The local news cycle was already in full swing. A reporter stood near the police barricade, her voice grave as she described Hank as a mentally unstable radical who was holding municipal secrets hostage while endangering the town with illegal chemical storage. A photo of Hank from a decade ago, one where he looked particularly disheveled after a long shift, flashed on the screen of a portable TV he kept for emergencies. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was a stream of vitriol from local residents calling for his immediate arrest. Hank clicked the power off, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise. He stared at his reflection in the dark glass, realizing he was now a ghost in his own home, a man erased by the very people he was trying to save. Hank reached into the bottom drawer of his workbench and pulled out an old, flared muzzle flare gun. The orange plastic felt cold and utilitarian in his hand. He checked the firing pin, the mechanical click sounding sharp in the quiet room. He began packing a rugged canvas rucksack with the essentials: a set of precision lockpicks, a portable soldering iron, and the 3 flash drives, each wrapped in protective foil. He pulled on his heavy work jacket, tightening the straps of the pack until they dug into his shoulders. He looked around the darkened, smoke-stained shop one last time. There was no more room for hesitation. He was a mechanic by trade, but tonight, he would have to be something else entirely if he wanted to survive the night. The sudden scream of tires on the gravel drive sent Hank diving for the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. He crawled to the gap in the boarded-up window, peering out into the twilight. Sheriff Miller was there, stepping out of his cruiser with a furtive, predatory grace. The man looked over both shoulders, his eyes darting toward the shadows of the construction site. From his pocket, Miller pulled a clear plastic bag containing a white, crystalline powder and a heavy, snub-nosed revolver with its serial numbers filed away. Hank watched, frozen, as Miller shoved the evidence into Hank's roadside mailbox, the metal lid clanging shut with finality. Miller then reached for his shoulder mic, his voice low as he began to broadcast the lies that would authorize a lethal response. Hank lunged for the back door of the workshop, throwing his weight against the frame. The old wood, weakened by the fire and years of rot, gave way with a sharp, splintering crack. At the same moment, the front of the building shuddered under the impact of a tactical ram. The sound of shattering glass and the roar of "Police! Down on the floor!" filled the shop. Hank didn't look back. He sprinted for the perimeter fence, his fingers catching the cold, rusted wire as he hauled himself upward. The jagged barbs at the top snagged his sleeve, tearing the heavy fabric. But he rolled over and dropped into the thick, sodden carpet of leaves on the forest slope. Behind him, a flashbang detonated, the world turning a blinding, electric white for a fraction of a second. He scrambled into the dense embrace of the hemlocks, the beams of high-powered tactical lights sweeping the trees like the fingers of a search party. A staticky burst from a discarded radio near a construction trailer reached his ears as he hunkered down. It was Miller's voice, cold and stripped of its humanity. The sheriff was declaring a Code Zero, authorizing a shoot-to-kill order for a domestic terrorist who had fired upon officers. The lie hung in the damp night air like a fog. Hank pressed his back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, his lungs burning. In the distance, the first sharp, rhythmic barks of bloodhounds echoed through the valley. He wasn't just a fugitive now. He was prey. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the dead leaves felt like a closing trap. The Kentucky brush was a wall of thorns and wet branches that clawed at Hank's face as he pushed deeper into the hills. He was heading for the Black Maw, a long-abandoned coal mine that sat like a scar on the ridge. Rain began to fall, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned his flannel shirt into a heavy, freezing weight. His boots slipped on the slick clay of the ravine, and he found himself clawing at exposed roots just to keep his footing. Every breath was a jagged rasp in his throat. He reached the entrance of the mine just as his legs began to give way, the darkness of the shaft swallowing him whole. He collapsed onto the damp stone floor, the sound of the hounds fading into the steady drum of the rain. Inside the darkness of the shaft, Hank struck a match. The tiny, flickering flame illuminated a jagged shard of a broken mirror leaning against a rotted timber support. He stared at the reflection, a man with hollowed-out eyes, his skin smeared with grease and Kentucky mud. His hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that made the match flame dance. A sudden, sharp sob caught in his throat, and he squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream into the blackness. The weight of the mountain above him felt like the weight of the town's betrayal, a crushing pressure that threatened to extinguish the last of his resolve. He felt smaller than he ever had, a speck of dust in the gears of a machine that didn't care if it crushed him. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, battery-operated transistor radio, carefully turning the dial through the static. The smooth, practiced voice of Mayor Thornton cut through the white noise. The man was speaking at a pre-festival gala, his tone dripping with a false, paternal warmth. He was inviting the good people of Hollow Creek to the Founders' Day picnic at the Central Rotunda the following afternoon. Thornton spoke of unity and the dawn of a new era, his words punctuated by the faint, upbeat brass of a rehearsal band. Hank gripped the radio, the plastic casing creaking under his strength. While the town prepared to feast on Thornton's lies, the poison was already being mapped for their soil. Hank cleared a flat spot on a stone ledge and emptied his rucksack. He laid out the guts of a salvaged radio, several coils of copper wire, and his portable soldering iron. By the light of a small LED lantern, he began to work. His fingers, despite the cold and the tremors, moved with the muscle memory of a lifetime spent fixing things. He was building a crude, high-gain transmitter, something powerful enough to override the local multimedia feed at the Rotunda. The smell of hot solder and rosin filled the small pocket of the mine, a scent of purpose. This was his last wrench in the works. He soldered the final resistor into place, knowing that if he could just get close enough, Thornton's grand stage would become his own digital gallows. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Hank crept to the edge of the tree line overlooking Hollow Creek. The town looked like an occupied territory. Black SUVs belonging to Global Steel Security prowled the main drag, their roof-mounted spotlights scouring the alleys. He saw police checkpoints at every major intersection, the blue strobes of the cruisers cutting through the morning mist. Men in tactical gear stood with rifles slung low, checking the IDs of workers heading into the construction site. The town had been transformed into a grid of surveillance. Hank watched the patterns, timing the patrols, his mind working like a clockmaker's as he looked for a single, fraying thread in Thornton's net. He found his path in the town's belly. He dropped into a concrete drainage culvert on the outskirts, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and industrial runoff. Following the rusted, subterranean maps he'd memorized as a boy, he moved through the darkness of the storm drains. Above him, he could hear the heavy thud of boots and the growing festive roar of the crowd gathering for the picnic. He waded through ankle-deep sludge, his head ducked beneath the low, dripping concrete arches. He navigated by the vibration of the world above until he reached a rusted iron ladder leading to a manhole cover just 20 yards from the main stage of the rotunda. He eased the lid up an inch, seeing the polished shoes of Thornton's security detail passing just feet away. Hank moved with a ghost's silence behind the heavy, red velvet curtains of the rotunda stage. Through a sliver in the fabric, he saw Thornton. The mayor was standing at the podium, adjusting his microphone and smoothing the pages of his speech. Two security guards with coiled earpieces stood at the edges of the stage, their eyes scanning the cheering crowd like hawks. Hank could see the fine beads of sweat on the back of the mayor's neck and hear the rehearsed, oily chuckle he gave to a front-row donor. The sunlight caught the gold of Thornton's watch, a bright, mocking flicker. Hank reached into his pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of his transmitter, waiting for the precisely timed moment when the opening anthem would draw every eye to the flag. He crawled on his belly toward the massive gray steel distribution hub hidden behind a bank of floral arrangements. He pulled his wrench from his belt and applied a steady, silent pressure to the cabinet's lock. It gave way with a muffled click. Inside was a chaotic heart of fiber-optic cables and glowing server blades. The heat from the processors washed over his face, and the low hum of the cooling fans vibrated in his chest. His hands moved with frantic precision, identifying the primary video feed that fed the massive LED screens flanking the stage. He disconnected the official global steel presentation cable, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he prepared to feed the truth into the town's jugular. Hank took a long, shuddering breath, trying to steady his forearms. He slid the first flash drive into the server's bypass port. On the small maintenance monitor inside the cabinet, a data transfer bar began to race. Above him, he heard Thornton's voice boom through the speakers. "My fellow citizens, today we don't just build a factory, we build a future." Hank's finger hovered over the execute command. He looked at the glowing screen, then at the shadows of the guards on the curtain. With a final, sharp movement of his thumb, he initiated the override. Hank slammed his palm against the execute button on his makeshift transmitter, and the copper coils hummed with a high-pitched electric whine. On the three massive LED screens towering over the rotunda, the pristine blue sky imagery of Global Steel's promotional video shattered into a jagged mess of digital static. A heartbeat later, the screens erupted with the neon green lines of the underground chemical reservoirs, the words lethal cyanide compounds, flashing in stark, clinical white. The financial spreadsheets followed, scrolling with relentless speed, showing Richard Thornton's name alongside offshore accounts and multi-million-dollar wire transfers. The cold, blue light from the screens washed over the stunned crowd, turning the festive afternoon into a stark, technological courtroom. Every secret, every bribe, and every planned poison was suddenly laid bare in 40-foot-tall letters. Mayor Thornton froze. The word prosperity died in his throat, replaced by a hollow, wet rasp. He turned slowly, his face drained of color, his skin appearing gray and translucent under the glare of his own betrayal. The screen behind him now displayed a high-resolution scan of his personal signature on the Toxic Waste Acceptance Manifest. Beads of sweat broke through his heavy makeup, carving tracks down his cheeks. His fingers spasmed against the edges of the podium, gripping the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. The microphone, still live, broadcast his ragged, panicked breathing to every corner of the square. The gold city seal on his lapel seemed to shrink under the collective gaze of the thousands he had sold for a profit. The initial silence of the square was replaced by a low, guttural murmur that swelled into a deafening roar of fury. The residents of Hollow Creek surged forward, the flimsy wooden barricade snapping like dry kindling. On the central screen, a private email from Thornton appeared, his words describing the townspeople as uneducated overhead and necessary casualties. A woman in the front row, her face contorted with rage, hurled a plastic cup of dark juice. It splashed across Thornton's white dress shirt like a spreading wound. The crowd moved as a single, vengeful organism, a sea of raised fists and glowing smartphones capturing the mayor's public execution. The air, once sweet with the smell of fried dough, now tasted of ozone and impending violence. Sheriff Miller didn't hesitate. He unsnapped the thumb brake on his holster and lunged toward the distribution cabinet, shoving technicians out of his way with a desperate violence. Hank saw him coming and slammed his hand onto the server's emergency lockout. The steel bolts of the cabinet hissed shut. At that exact moment, the festive fireworks, triggered by the stage's automated clock, began to detonate. Brilliant bursts of crimson and gold erupted over the rotunda, filling the air with a thick, sulfurous smoke. Hank used the chaos to dive behind the heavy velvet curtains. Through the shifting gray haze, he saw the frantic, strobe-lit silhouette of Miller fruitlessly hammering his fist against the armored server door as the evidence continued to loop for all to see. The Global Steel security team tried to form a human wall around the mayor, but the wave of citizens broke over them with the force of a flash flood. Hank watched from the shadows as a guard reached for his baton, only to have his arms seized by a man in a greasy mechanic's jumpsuit. The peaceful picnic had vanished, replaced by a chaotic brawl. People were tearing at the guards' uniforms, pulling them away from the stage. The sound of ripping fabric and the rhythmic thud of feet on the wooden stage floors echoed through the square. Police caps were kicked into the dirt. The struggle was a mess of denim and tactical nylon, a town finally reclaiming its ground from the men who had been paid to occupy it. Hank found the iron ring of the utility hatch and hauled it open. He slid into the cool, damp darkness of the town hall's basement, just as the massive oak podium above him was toppled by the crowd. He sprinted through the low-ceilinged maintenance tunnels, the dust-coated bulbs overhead flickering with every heavy impact from the floor above. The very foundation of the building seemed to vibrate with the town's collective scream. He could hear the muffled sound of glass shattering and the roar of a community tearing down the stage of its own deception. He moved through the dark, feeling the gritty plaster rain down on his jacket, a man running through the guts of a dying system. On the far side of the rotunda, Thornton scrambled out the back exit, hoping to reach his idling limousine. But the shadows of the parking lot were already filled with men in stained work clothes. In the center stood Jake Harris, his face a mask of cold, hard stone, a heavy pipe wrench hanging from his hand. Thornton tried to retreat, but the circle of workers closed in, their silence more terrifying than the shouting in the square. Thornton backed into the brick wall of the rotunda, clutching his empty leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Jake pointed a calloused finger toward the screens, still glowing in the distance. Thornton slid down the wall, his eyes wide and vacant as he looked up at the grim, unmoving faces of the men he had dismissed as mere statistics. Hank emerged from a ventilation grate on the ridge overlooking the town. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of smoke. Below, Hollow Creek was a swirling vortex of blue and red lights. From the main highway, a long, relentless line of headlights approached. The federal authorities. Heavy black vans with high-gain antennas sped into the town center, their sirens a high, piercing wail that cut through the local chaos. The information Hank had broadcast had reached the agencies beyond Thornton's reach. The machine was now turning on itself, the state's power descending to harvest the corruption Hank had tilled. He began the long walk back toward his shop, but he was forced to stop at the edge of his neighborhood. A mob of his own neighbors stood in the road, their faces lit by the flickering orange glow of makeshift torches. Old Mrs. Green was screaming, her voice a shrill rasp as she cursed Hank for killing the only hope the town had left. To these people, the truth was a luxury they couldn't afford. They saw only the loss of the jobs Thornton had promised. A heavy stone whistled past Hank's ear, shattering a nearby fence post. The very people he had risked his life to protect now looked at him with a murderous heat, their desperation curdling into a blind, directed hate. Hank watched, frozen in the shadows, as the first gasoline-soaked bottle impacted his workshop's window. An orange blossom of fire erupted instantly, climbing the dry cedar siding with a hungry, rhythmic crackle. Through the glass, he saw the flames engulf his lathe, his father's old workbench, and the shelves of tools he had spent a lifetime collecting. The heat pushed him back, a physical wall of air that smelled of scorched paint and ancient oil. The workshop, the only home he had ever truly known, became a roaring pillar of fire that sent towers of sparks into the black Kentucky sky. He stood in the darkness, the smell of his burning life filling his lungs, while the crowd cheered the destruction of their own salvation. As the first light of dawn began to gray the smoke-filled sky, Hank sat on the charred, skeletal remains of his workbench. His hands were black with soot, and the smell of the fire was etched into his skin. Down the road, a slow procession of federal vehicles moved through the mud. In the back of a black SUV, Hank saw Thornton, his face pressed against the glass, stripped of his silk-clad arrogance, appearing small and broken. Miller followed in another car, his head bowed, his badge and his pride gone. Hank watched the parade of the fallen through the haze of the smoldering ruins. He felt no surge of victory, no warmth of justice. He felt only a hollow, aching silence. He reached down into the ash and pulled out a small, blackened gear, the only piece of his machinery that hadn't warped in the heat. He turned it over in his hands, the metal still warm. The town was saved from the poison, but it was broken in ways a wrench couldn't fix. He stood up, the gear heavy in his pocket, and began to walk away from the ashes of Hollow Creek, a man who had won the war but lost the world he fought for.